I buried my husband 4 years ago. I stood over an empty casket in the rain, held my son's hand, and told him his father was never coming home. I believed it. I built a whole life on that belief, a smaller life, a quieter one, but mine. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon somewhere over Colorado, my 9-year-old son turned to me with a face gone the color of ash and whispered 4 words that split my world in half. "Mom, Dad's back there." I laughed it off. I told him it wasn't possible. Then I turned around and I saw the watch on that man's wrist, and I stopped breathing. The trip had been Ethan's idea, or maybe it had been mine, and I'd let him think it was his. Either way, it had taken me 4 years to agree to it, our first real vacation since Christian died. Just the two of us, 5 days on the Gulf Coast. I'd booked a resort with a pool shaped like a starfish because Ethan had pointed at the picture and said, "That one," without hesitation, and something in me had cracked open with relief at seeing him want something again. We were at the gate when he first went quiet. I noticed it the way I notice everything about him now, carefully, like checking a wound to see if it had reopened. He was staring past me over my shoulder at the boarding line behind us. "Ethan." He didn't answer. I followed his eyes and saw nothing but a crowd of ordinary people, dragging ordinary suitcases, a woman on her phone, a man in a gray jacket with his back to us. "You okay, Bug?" He nodded too fast, the kind of nod that isn't really an answer. I let it go. Kids get strange at airports. Too much stimulation, too many strangers, too much waiting. I told myself that all the way down the jet bridge, all the way to our seats, 14C and 14D, a row we'd chosen together off the seat map 2 weeks earlier. Ethan tracing his finger along the aisle like it was a maze. We settled in. I helped him with his seatbelt, even though he didn't need help anymore, because some habits outlive their usefulness, and I hadn't figured out how to let go of them. The plane taxied. Ethan sat rigid beside me, his knuckles pale around the armrest, and when I asked what was wrong, he said the thing again, quieter this time, like he was afraid. Saying it louder would make it more true. The dad sitting 2 rows behind us. I turned around before I could stop myself. I told myself I was doing it to prove him wrong, to show him there was nothing there but strangers, so he could relax and enjoy his vacation like a normal little boy. There was a man 2 rows back aisle seat, a paperback open on his knee that he wasn't reading. Sandy brown hair threaded with gray at the temples in a way I recognized before I let myself recognize it. Broad shoulders, slightly hunched, the particular way of sitting that comes from a man trying to take up less space than his body wants to. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up, and then I saw his left hand resting on the armrest, and on it a wedding band, and the way his thumb moved against it. An old unconscious habit, turning the ring in small circles when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to think about. I used to watch Christian do that at the kitchen table while he did our taxes. I used to watch him do it in the hospital waiting room the night Ethan was born. I faced forward. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them flat against my thighs. I told myself it was grief playing tricks, the mind's cruel talent for building a beloved face out of nothing. A stranger's jaw, a stranger's hand, 4 years of missing someone poured into the wrong body. I told myself this the entire flight, 3 hours of telling myself a story I no longer believed. While beside me, Ethan sat frozen and silent, occasionally whispering things I didn't want to hear. He looked at me, Mom. When we were boarding, he looked right at me, and then he looked away really fast. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I stared straight ahead at the seat back in front of me. At the little screen showing our flight path, crawling across a map of the country. And I thought about the folded flag they'd given me at the memorial. The one with nobody underneath it. The one the Coast Guard couldn't recover from 60 feet of cold water off the coast of Maine. I thought about 4 years of birthdays and Christmases and Tuesday nights where I set the table for 2 and cleared a plate that was never dirtied. I thought about how carefully, how completely I had let myself believe he was gone, because the alternative that he might have chosen to leave us was a wound I couldn't survive twice. The plane began its descent. My ears popped. Ethan reached over and took my hand, and his fingers were freezing. When we landed, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin filled with the shuffle of people standing, reaching for bags. murmuring to each other in the particular relief of arrival. I stayed seated as long as I could, but eventually, the aisle cleared, and the man 2 rows back stood and turned, and for one full second across the width of a commercial airplane cabin, we looked directly at each other. It was Christian's face. Older, thinner, weathered in ways 4 years, and a different life will do to a man. But it was his face, the face I had memorized in a hospital hallway, the face I had kissed goodbye 1,000 ordinary mornings, the face I had grieved until grief became simply who I was. My husband was alive, and he was standing 2 rows away looking at me like I was the ghost. I did not scream. I did not run toward him. Some instinct older than shock kept my body still, kept my face arranged into something that could pass for confusion, while every part of me that had spent 4 years learning how to survive without him screamed silently instead. Christian looked away first. He gathered a duffel bag from the overhead bin, said something low to a woman standing beside him. A woman I hadn't even registered until that moment, blonde, maybe mid-30s, wearing sunglasses pushed up into her hair, and walked up the aisle without looking back. Ethan gripped my hand so hard it hurt. "That was him, right, Mom? That was really him." I told my son the only true thing I had. "I don't know yet, baby, but we're going to find out." We collected our bags in a fog. I moved through baggage claim on autopilot, scanning every face, every gray jacket, every set of shoulders that might belong to a dead man. I caught sight of him, once more near the rental car counters, the blonde woman's hand tucked into his arm, both of them laughing at something easy and unhurried, like people with nowhere urgent to be, and nothing to hide. The ordinariness of it was almost worse than the shock. My husband had died so easily, so believably that I had built a funeral, a headstone, a version of my life around his absence, and here he was, laughing in an airport 4 years later, tanned and alive, and touching another woman's hand like it belonged there. I did not confront him. Every instinct told me to, but something colder and more practical rose up beneath the panic. The same instinct, maybe, that had gotten me through his memorial, without collapsing. Through the insurance paperwork, through the year afterward, when I had to relearn how to fill a silence, that I needed information before I needed answers. So, instead of running toward him, I followed him quietly at a distance. Ethan's hand locked in mine. They loaded into a resort shuttle. I checked the logo stitched onto the driver's polo shirt against the confirmation email still open on my phone. It was the same resort, the exact same one I had booked 8 weeks earlier on a whim, because my son had pointed at a starfish-shaped pool. That couldn't be a coincidence, and even in my days, I knew it. Coincidences that large don't happen by accident. Someone had either known we were coming, or something stranger was at work, and either possibility terrified me more than seeing his face had. I called Daniel Ross from the back of a taxi, my voice flat and strange in my own ears. Daniel had been our family lawyer for 12 years, had sat beside me through the entire process of having Christian declared legally dead, had held my hand literally the day the settlement came through. When I told him what I'd seen, there was a long silence on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Julia," he finally said, "if that's really Christian, you need to understand what you're describing. You're describing insurance fraud. You're describing a man who let a death certificate get issued in his name. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime, and it's one you unknowingly benefited from." I hadn't thought of it that way. I had only been thinking of him as my husband dead, and now somehow not dead. I hadn't thought about the $240,000 sitting in a trust for Ethan's education, the policy that had let me keep our house, the fact that every dollar of it now sat on top of a lie I hadn't known I was living. "Don't approach him," Daniel said. "Don't say anything to anyone at that resort. Just watch and call me if anything changes. I need to look into a few things on my end." That night, after Ethan had cried himself into an exhausted sleep in the room beside mine, I sat on my balcony with the lights off and listened. Voices carried strangely along the row of balconies that faced the courtyard pool, and 2 floors down and 3 doors over, I heard a voice I would have recognized anywhere. Even now, even after everything, low, unhurried, with that particular cadence he used when he was trying to calm someone down. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. There was no more room left for doubt. I sat very still in the dark for a long time, running my thumb along the edge of my own wedding band, the one I still wore. Though I'd told myself for years it was only habit. I thought about the version of me that had knelt in a cemetery and thrown a handful of dirt onto an empty box. I thought about how she would feel if she knew what I now knew, that the man she'd mourned had a laugh, and a rental car, and a woman's hand tucked into his arm, and had simply chosen at some point not to come home. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the walkway below, and against my better judgment, I leaned toward the railing and looked down. But Christian stood alone near the pool, his back mostly to me, phone pressed to his ear, voice too quiet to carry. And then, as if some old instinct told him he was being watched, he turned his head and looked directly up at my balcony. Our eyes met for the second time that day. This time he didn't look away first. He held my gaze for 3 long seconds, long enough for something to pass between us that had no name, not quite recognition, not quite warning. And then he turned and walked quickly back inside, like a man who had just realized he'd been caught. By morning, I understood something that changed the shape of everything. The Christian hadn't been surprised to see me. That single look on the balcony had confirmed it. A man who believes he's run into his supposedly dead wife by pure accident does not simply glance up, hold eye contact, and walk away like he's closing a door. He reacts. He panics, or he runs toward you, or he freezes entirely. Christian had done none of those things. He had looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he'd been expecting to arrive eventually. I didn't sleep. I spent the early hours turning that thought over, and by the time Ethan woke, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to walk up to that pool and demand an explanation. I was going to find out exactly what I was dealing with before I let him know how much I already suspected. I dropped Ethan at the resort's kids club for the morning. A small mercy watching him run off toward a group of other children temporarily unburdened, and went to the front desk with a manufactured question about a wrong charge on my room. The kind of small lie that gets a hotel employee talking. I described Christian carefully without using his name. The young man at the desk, eager to be helpful, pulled up a reservation and turned the screen toward me before catching himself. The name on the room wasn't Christian Price. It was Christopher Reyes. I made myself thank him and walk away calmly, though my hands didn't stop shaking until I was back in my own room, with the door locked. A man doesn't accidentally end up with a different first name and a different last name. That takes a passport. That takes years of quiet, deliberate work. I rented a car that afternoon under the excuse of wanting to see the coastline. And instead, I watched. I am not proud of how easily I fell into it, the parking 2 rows back, the sunglasses, the particular stillness of a woman pretending to read a paperback while actually cataloging every person who came and went from a hotel lobby. Grief had taught me patience. Apparently, it had also taught me how to disappear in plain sight. I watched Vanessa. I'd heard Christian call her that once, softly, across the pool deck, laugh at something on her phone, while Christian sat beside her quiet, scanning the crowd the way a man does when he's used to checking exits. I watched them leave together in a rented sedan just after 4, and I followed at a distance that felt both reckless and inevitable. They drove 20 minutes inland to a strip mall diner, unremarkable, the kind of place tourists never find. Vanessa waited in the car. Christian went in alone and sat across from an older man I didn't recognize. Silver hair, a suit too formal for the setting, a leather folder set precisely on the table between them, like a prop in a scene rehearsed many times before. I couldn't get close enough to hear everything. I sat 2 booths away with my phone propped against a napkin dispenser recording, praying the diner's ambient noise wouldn't swallow every word. Most of it did, but fragments survived. The insurance won't reopen if nobody documents are clean, Christopher. I made sure. She can never know the account exists. I sat frozen through the rest of the conversation, unable to eat the food I'd ordered as cover, watching my supposedly dead husband nod along to a stranger's instructions about documents and accounts, and things I was apparently never meant to know. That night, I sent the recording and everything I'd learned to Daniel. He called back within the hour, and his voice had lost its careful lawyerly calm. "Julia, I pulled everything I could on Christopher Reyes. There's a social security number, a driver's license issued 3 years ago in Nevada. Credit history going back to right around the time Christian's death certificate was filed. He paused. I also pulled Christian Price's death certificate again, just to be sure. It's still on file, still valid. As far as the state of Maine is concerned, your husband has been dead for 4 years, so which one is real? That's what worries me, Daniel said. Because as far as I can tell, they both are 2 identities, 2 full documented lives, same face. I thought about the man in the diner booth sliding a folder across a table, with the practiced calm of someone who had done this many times before. I thought about the words insurance and documents and can't ever know, and about a woman waiting patiently in a parked car with no idea what she'd wandered into. Don't do anything, Daniel said. Don't confront him. Call me every hour. And if anything changes, anything at all, you call me first before you do anything else. I promised him I would. I meant it when I said it, but that night, lying awake in a hotel room, 2 floors above a man who had let the world believe he'd drowned, I understood that watching from a distance was no longer going to be enough. Whatever Christian Price had become, he was no longer someone I could simply observe from a balcony and wait to understand. I decided to talk to Vanessa the next morning, though I told myself for an hour beforehand that I wouldn't. I told myself it was reckless, that Daniel had warned me against exactly this kind of move. But I kept thinking about her waiting patiently in that parked car outside the diner, laughing at her phone with no idea what her boyfriend had just handed a stranger in a leather folder. Whatever Christian had become, she hadn't chosen this. She deserved at minimum someone willing to look her in the eye. I found her by the pool, alone, Christian off somewhere on one of his mysterious errands. I sat 2 loungers down and struck up the kind of conversation strangers have at resorts, whether the overpriced piña coladas, whether the beach or the pool was better in the afternoon heat. She was easy to talk to, warmer than I expected, with a laugh that came quickly and without guard. I hated how much I liked her within the first 5 minutes. She mentioned her boyfriend eventually, the way people do when they're happy and want an excuse to talk about it. 2 years together, she told me. He'd said he was a widower. No kids, he'd told her that specifically. That he and his late wife had never had children, that it was one of the quiet griefs of his first marriage. He'd said he moved out west to leave old memories behind. I kept my face still and asked the kind of gentle follow-up questions that invite more sharing rather than suspicion. She showed me pictures on her phone, unprompted, proud, in the easy way of new love Christian on a hiking trail. Christian cooking in what I recognized instantly as a kitchen that wasn't ours. Christian laughing at something off camera. And then one photo, an older one at some kind of anniversary dinner. His left hand rested on the table, and even scaled down on a phone screen I could see it. He still wore his wedding ring, turned inward, the band facing his palm easy to miss, unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Something in my chest cracked open in a way I hadn't expected. Not relief, not vindication, something closer to grief. Fresh and strange grief for a version of loyalty I couldn't make sense of. A man does not accidentally keep his wedding ring turned inward on his hand for years, while building an entirely separate life with someone else. That isn't carelessness. That's a decision repeated every single morning to remember what he'd walked away from. I excused myself before Vanessa could notice my hands trembling. I told her it was lovely meeting her, and I meant it, and that unsettled me more than almost anything else that had happened since the airport. That evening, walking Ethan back from the kids' club, Christian found me. Not accidentally, I understood that nothing about this man's movements around me had ever been accidental. He stepped out from beside a row of palm trees along the path, and Ethan froze mid-step beside me, staring up at his father with an expression I couldn't begin to name. Nor Christian didn't look at Ethan first. He looked at me. 4 years compressed into a single terrible silence, and then he said the only thing he seemed able to manage, "Please, not here." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to demand every answer at once. Why? How? What he'd told himself in the 4 years he'd let his son grow up believing he was dead. Instead, I found myself simply nodding, because Ethan was standing right there, small and rigid, and watching his father with the kind of raw, unguarded hope that broke something loose in my chest. Christian's eyes moved to him. Then finally, and something passed across his face, pain unmistakable real, before he forced himself to turn and walk away. Ethan didn't cry until we were back in our room. He asked me questions I had no answers for. Why didn't Dad hug me? Why did he look sad? Is he going to come home now? I held my son and told him the only honest thing I had left. I don't know yet, baby. But I'm going to find out, and I promise I won't stop until I do. Later, once Ethan had finally drifted off, I stepped out onto the balcony for air and noticed something I hadn't before. A man in a dark jacket standing near the far end of the courtyard, not moving, not on his phone, simply watching the building. Watching. I realized with a slow chill the exact section where Christian's room was. I had spent 2 days convinced I was the only one hunting for the truth. Standing there in the dark, I understood for the first time that I might not be the only one watching Christian Price. And if that was true, then whatever he was running from 4 years ago might not be finished with him yet. Christian came to my room just after midnight. I almost didn't open the door. Every instinct told me to call Daniel first, to follow the plan, to not be alone with a man I no longer knew how to read. But I opened it anyway because some part of me needed to hear whatever he'd come to say. Needed it more than I needed to be careful. He didn't try to embrace me. He didn't apologize first the way I'd imagined he might in the darker hours of the last 2 nights. He stood in the doorway looking older than his years and said the only thing that mattered. Everything you believe about what happened to me is only half true. I let him in. I sat across from him at the small table by the window, arms crossed, and told him to start talking and not stop until I understood everything. He told me about a man named Aldrich Voss, a name I'd never heard, a business partner in a shipping logistics venture Christian had quietly invested in the year before he disappeared. He told me the venture had been a front that he'd stumbled onto financial records that didn't add up, transfers routed through accounts that existed only on paper money, moving in patterns that made sense only if you assumed the cargo being shipped wasn't the cargo being declared. He told me he'd tried to go to the authorities quietly, and that within a week someone had made it clear to him, without ever saying it outright, that his family's safety depended on his silence. They didn't threaten me directly, he said. They're smarter than that. They mentioned Ethan's school. They mentioned your route to work. That was the whole message. He told me about the fishing trip, about how it hadn't been an accident so much as an opportunity he'd manufactured out of desperation. A boat capsized deliberately in a stretch of water known for its currents. A life vest left floating where it would be found. A body that would never surface because there had never been a body to surface. He told me it was the only way he could think of to make the danger disappear from our lives without dragging us through it. I didn't believe him. Not entirely. Not yet. Grief doesn't undo itself just because someone hands you a story that fits the shape of the pain. If that's true, I said, then why didn't you come back once it was safe? Why did I get 4 years of silence and a woman named Vanessa, who thinks you buried a wife who never existed? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way I remembered from the worst nights of our marriage. The nights when something in him closed like a fist, because I didn't know when it would be safe. And every year that passed coming back got harder to imagine, not easier. I told myself I was protecting you by staying gone. I'm not sure anymore how much of that was true, and how much was just easier than facing what I'd done to you both. He handed me a small drive, the kind that fits in a coat pocket, along with a folded page of handwritten names and account numbers. He told me it was everything the man in the diner, Aldrich Voss's network, the documentation that had taken him years to quietly assemble from the shadows of his second life. He said it was proof, if I wanted proof, that at least the reason he'd vanished had been real. I called Daniel the moment Christian left. He took the drive from me the next morning without a word, disappearing into his room with his laptop for nearly 3 hours. When he finally came out, his face had the particular stillness of a man forcing himself to stay professional. It's real, Julia. The accounts, the names, the transfer patterns, it all checks out against public shipping and customs records. Whatever this operation was, it was real, and it was serious enough that federal agencies would have wanted a piece of it. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something colder settle into my chest, because the facts explained why he vanished. They didn't explain why he'd let his son learn to walk, lose his first tooth, learn to read, and grow into the boy standing frozen on a resort pathway last night. All without a single word from the father, who'd apparently been watching from a careful distance the entire time. I asked Christian that question directly later, that same day, and he had no answer that satisfied either of us. He simply said he was sorry in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had run out of better words to offer. That evening, standing at the window of my room, I watched a black sedan pull into the resort's front drive official in a way that made my stomach tighten before I even saw the man who stepped out of it, broad-shouldered, gray-suited, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone whose presence didn't require explanation. He walked directly to the front desk and showed the clerk something I couldn't see from this distance, but I recognized the gesture. A badge, or the private sector equivalent of one. Daniel's voice came back to me suddenly from days earlier, a warning I hadn't fully understood until now. If that's Christian, everything about his death becomes a crime. Someone besides us had finally noticed that a dead man was still very much alive. The man from the black sedan introduced himself the next morning at my door as Marcus Hale, an investigator with the insurance carrier that had paid out Christian's death benefit 4 years earlier. He was courteous in the careful, practiced way of someone who had delivered difficult news to 100 people before me, and he made no attempt to soften why he was there. A routine data match, he explained, had flagged a passport re-entry under the name Christopher Reyes, with biometric markers close enough to Christian Price's old driver's license photo to warrant a look. My name being listed on the original claim had led him straight to my door. I didn't lie to him. I was too tired to lie to anyone anymore. I told him what I knew, though. I left out the drive Christian had given me the names, the details of Aldrich Voss. That information belonged to Daniel until we understood exactly what we were protecting and from whom. Marcus listened without much reaction, took notes in a small leather notebook, and told me the insurance company would be opening a fraud investigation, regardless of any other circumstances. He was polite about it. It didn't make the words land any softer. I confronted Christian that afternoon, and for the first time since the airport, I asked him the question I'd been most afraid to ask. Had he touched the money? $240,000 sitting in an account meant for Ethan's future, built on the lie of his death. He looked almost offended that I'd have to ask. He told me he hadn't spent a cent of it, hadn't gone near it, had specifically structured his disappearance so that account would remain untouched. A strange, twisted act of integrity buried inside an enormous betrayal. Daniel confirmed it within the hour. Every dollar was exactly where it had been left, gathering interest unclaimed by the man who could have taken it and vanished somewhere far more comfortable than a strip mall diner meeting with a man in an ill-fitting suit. Then why? I asked him, sitting across from him on a bench near the resort's empty tennis courts, the ocean loud and indifferent behind us. Why not come back the moment you knew we were safe? You're telling me you watched us. You knew where Ethan went to school. You knew when I changed jobs. That's not a man in hiding from danger. That's a man who chose to stay away. He was quiet for a long time before he answered, and when he did, his voice had none of the practiced calm from our earlier conversations. It cracked in places the way it hadn't in years, not since the early days of our marriage, when he still let himself be seen struggling. Because every year I stayed away, I told myself you were better off. That you'd built something without me that I'd only ruin by walking back into it. And the longer I told myself that story, the more true it started to feel. Even though I think some part of me always knew, it was just the easiest way to keep hiding from what I'd actually done to you both. I didn't cry out of anger, not in that moment. I cried unexpectedly, because I finally understood something about the man in front of me that no amount of investigation could have shown me. Whatever protection he thought he was offering us, he had also been serving a sentence of his own making, 4 years of watching from outside, a life he wasn't allowed to enter. 4 years of knowing his son's school and his wife's new job, and never once being able to walk through the front door and simply be there. He hadn't escaped anything. He had built himself a different kind of prison and moved into it willingly and called it love. It didn't excuse him. I want to be clear about that even now. Grief and forgiveness are not the same current, and I wasn't ready to let one carry me toward the other. But something in me softened toward the shape of his suffering, even while the rest of me stayed furious at the years he'd stolen from Ethan. That evening, Marcus returned, this time with a folder of his own, and the conversation took a turn none of us had anticipated. The financial network Christian had fled Aldrich Voss's shipping operation had drawn far more federal attention over the past 2 years than Christian himself had realized while hiding from it. Marcus told us investigators had already built most of a case, using channels entirely separate from Christian's information. What they hadn't had until now was a witness willing to testify to how the operation had specifically threatened a private citizen into faking his own death to keep quiet. "Your husband," Marcus said, choosing the word carefully, watching my face as he said it, "wasn't the architect of anything. He was leverage. Somebody used him to keep a much larger operation quiet. And whoever orchestrated the scheme that made his death look convincing is the person we actually want." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. Christian hadn't been the villain of this story after all, not exactly. He'd been a frightened, flawed man who had made an unforgivable choice for reasons that were at least real. But someone else, someone still unnamed, still out there, had built the machinery that made his disappearance possible in the first place. And that person had never once had to answer. For the 4 years my son grew up without a father. The arrests came 3 weeks later after we'd all returned home, and the resort had become nothing more than a place I never wanted to see again. Marcus called Daniel first, and Daniel called me. And within a single phone conversation I learned that Aldrich Voss and 2 of his associates had been taken into federal custody on charges spanning money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges built on financial records that reached back years before Christian had ever gotten tangled in the operation. The evidence Christian had handed me in a hotel room, the drive I'd carried home in my coat pocket like something radioactive, had become one piece of a much larger case the federal government had already been quietly building. Christian was never charged with anything connected to Voss's operation. The investigators were clear about that, and clear about crediting his cooperation, but faking his own death, filing false paperwork, and living under a fabricated identity for 4 years were crimes in their own right, regardless of how sympathetic the reasons behind them had been. He turned himself involuntarily, the week after we returned, walking into a federal building in a gray suit that made him look like a stranger, and I sat in the hallway outside with Ethan's hand in mine, while lawyers used words like restitution and cooperation agreement. And time served in ways that meant very little to a 9-year-old boy who only wanted to know if his father was going to prison forever. He wasn't. The judge weighing 4 years of self-imposed exile against a man who had ultimately helped dismantle a criminal operation rather than profit from it, handed down a sentence of probation and several hundred hours of community service, along with a formal repayment plan for the insurance benefit the company had already quietly agreed not to fully reclaim given the circumstances. It wasn't justice in any clean sense. It was simply the shape the law had room for. Vanessa left before any of the hearings concluded. I heard secondhand through people who still knew people at the resort that she'd moved back to Ohio, closer to her sisters, and that she hadn't spoken to Christian since the week the truth came apart in her hands. I thought about her sometimes in the months that followed a woman who'd fallen in love with a man built entirely out of a lie, who'd lost 2 years to a relationship that never had a real name attached to it. I hoped wherever she was that she'd found her way to something honest. Christian asked to see Ethan before his first day of court-mandated community service, and I said yes, though everything in me still hesitated at the idea. I told myself it wasn't for Christian. It was for my son, who deserved the chance to say whatever he needed to say, to the father he'd spent 4 years believing was dead, and one strange disorienting week learning was alive. The meeting happened in my living room of all places, the most ordinary setting for the strangest conversation of our lives. Neil Christian knelt down to Ethan's height, something he used to do naturally when Ethan was small, and I watched the years of habit come back into his body even after everything that had changed. He didn't reach for a hug. He didn't ask for one. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said, and his voice broke in a way I'd never once heard in 12 years of marriage. Ethan looked at him for a long time, longer than felt comfortable, the kind of long, unflinching look only children seem capable of giving. And then he said the sentence that undid something in both of us at once. "I already learned how to live without you." There were no tears from Ethan. There was only a kind of calm, steady honesty that told me my son had grown into someone stronger and more clear-eyed than either of his parents had managed to be. Christian cried openly, kneeling on our living room floor, and I stood in the doorway and let him, because it wasn't my place to soften that moment for him. He had earned every bit of it. We didn't get back together. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters, and because I think it's the ending our story actually deserved, rather than the one a simpler story might have handed us. New Christian moved into a small apartment across town, close enough to make his community service and his visits with Ethan manageable, far enough that our lives no longer overlapped by accident. We became something neither of us had a good word for, not strangers, not a couple, just two people bound permanently by a boy who loved us both, and by a truth we'd both had to learn to carry differently. Some evenings, watching Ethan set the table for the three of us, on the nights Christian came for dinner, I think about the woman I was on that airplane, certain she was losing her mind, certain that grief had finally broken something essential in her. I think about how much simpler it would have been if he really had drowned that day on the water, if the story really had ended the way I'd buried it 4 years earlier. Ill but simple was never actually true, and I've stopped wishing for the version of this that would have been easier to explain at dinner parties. 4 years ago, I buried the man I loved because I believed he was dead. This time, I bear the life we could never have again, not with grief, but with something closer to peace. The Christian survived the water. Our marriage didn't, and somehow accepting that hurt less than living inside a lie ever did. I want to know what you think this family's next chapter looks like. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you. So, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.